Create a 10-minute video on the topic. Political and economic analysis content, the steel tariff crisis and its economic fallout. As the 2025 second quarter rolls out, the U.S. economy finds itself at a critical juncture, where President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies are taking a toll. General Motors, GM, the iconic American automaker, reported a staggering $1.1 billion hit to its profits, a direct consequence of rising material costs. Steel, a seemingly inconspicuous commodity, has now become a central figure in this trade standoff, with its prices escalating by up to 30%. This shift, which has rattled the foundations of various industries, reflects the larger narrative unfolding in the North American economy. President Trump's return to the White House has reignited the trade battle with Canada, positioning tariffs as a cornerstone of his strategy to protect American jobs. But in practice, these tariffs are having an unintended effect, creating significant disruption both within the U.S. and across its borders. By mid-2025, the U.S. has slapped Canada with up to 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, and a 25% tariff on auto parts. Originally aimed at shielding American industries, the tariff policy has unleashed a chain of economic consequences, beginning with Canada's steel sector. While President Trump has vowed to protect U.S. jobs, his policies are doing just the opposite. The automotive industry is feeling the brunt, with GM and Stellantis reporting major financial losses due to escalating steel prices. The irony is that the tariffs, intended to insulate American companies, are actually hurting them. Steel and aluminum, two essential components for auto manufacturing, have become cost-prohibitive for automakers, who face mounting losses, estimated to run into billions. In response to these rising costs, U.S. automakers are forced to absorb the additional burden of tariffs, which push up production costs for each vehicle by anywhere from $2,000 to $4,700. This surge in input costs has caused American automakers to reconsider their global supply chains, which had been carefully constructed over the years under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA framework. The very agreement President Trump had renegotiated is now being undermined by his own policies, which are making cross-border trade more cumbersome and expensive. The frustration has been palpable in the boardrooms of major automakers who now face unpredictable tariffs and a volatile trade environment. The U.S. is not the only one affected. As the American steel market grapples with price hikes, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has shifted its strategy to mitigate the damage. In response to the tariffs, Canada has embarked on a national initiative to revitalize its domestic steel production, turning its focus toward reducing dependency on U.S. steel. Ontario, under Premier Doug Ford's leadership, has spearheaded this movement, committing to reindustrializing key sectors like aluminum and auto manufacturing. The push for self-reliance is not merely reactive, but is also part of a long-term strategic vision to strengthen Canada's industrial base and diversify its export markets. This policy shift has come with significant government backing. Carney's federal government has rolled out subsidies, slashed bureaucratic red tape, and fast-tracked investment approvals to ensure that the Canadian steel industry has the resources and infrastructure to flourish. The objective is clear. Canada aims to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market, which has long been a key trading partner. But as the U.S. continues to impose tariffs, Canada is not simply adjusting, it is seizing an opportunity to redirect its steel output to Asia and Europe, creating alternative avenues for trade. The impact of these developments is profound. Canada is no longer waiting for U.S. approval. By shifting its industrial focus, it is charting its own course and reducing its dependence on a country that, despite its proximity, has become increasingly unpredictable in its trade dealings. As a result, Canada's steel production is now redirecting its focus toward meeting the needs of European and Asian markets, a strategic pivot that could prove to be a game-changer for North American trade dynamics. The narrative surrounding this economic transformation is not just one of survival but also of reinvention. Canada, driven by necessity, is positioning itself as a competitive player in the global steel market. At the same time, the U.S. finds itself increasingly isolated as its tariff policies inadvertently fuel economic transformation across its borders. The geopolitical and economic repercussions of Trump's tariff strategy. While President Trump's tariffs were intended to bolster American industries, the unintended consequences of these policies are proving to be far-reaching. The steel tariff crisis in North America has escalated from a trade issue to a significant geopolitical dilemma, highlighting how economic decisions made in Washington are having ripple effects across the globe. As the U.S. economy struggles under the weight of higher costs, the question remains, is the country truly strengthening its position, or is it inadvertently sowing the seeds of its own isolation? One of the most striking outcomes of Trump's tariff strategy has been the shift in global trade alliances. Initially, the administration aimed to force better deals from America's trade partners, using tariffs as a pressure tool to renegotiate terms. But as the tariffs began to take hold, it became clear that many countries, including U.S. allies like Canada, were finding ways to bypass these new barriers, further eroding the very leverage Trump sought to gain. A telling example of this shift is the Canadian response to the tariffs. While the U.S. was expected to hold a dominant position in the global steel market, Canada's swift pivot towards self-sufficiency in steel production has altered the balance of power in North America. By reducing its reliance on U.S. imports, Canada is not only strengthening its industrial base, but also creating new export channels to markets beyond the U.S., including Asia and Europe. This move by Canada has not only reshaped its own industrial landscape, but has also had a profound impact on U.S. manufacturing. American automakers, already grappling with rising production costs due to tariffs, are now facing an additional challenge. Canadian steel and auto parts, which were once integral to the American supply chain, are now being redirected to other markets. This reallocation of resources is intensifying the pressure on U.S. companies that rely on affordable materials to stay competitive in a global marketplace. Meanwhile, the broader global response to U.S. tariffs has been equally telling. Countries that were once reluctant to challenge the U.S. have now begun to explore alternatives to American products. Japan and the United Kingdom, for example, have agreed to new tariff deals with the U.S., but even these countries are starting to hedge their bets, seeking out trade deals with other partners, particularly in Europe and Asia. This trend of countries seeking independent agreements outside of U.S. influence is not only a blow to U.S. economic power, but also a signal of the country's diminishing status on the global stage. Beyond steel and aluminum, Trump's tariffs have also inadvertently exposed America's vulnerability in other key sectors, particularly energy. For years, Canada has been an essential energy supplier to the U.S., providing crucial resources such as oil, natural gas, and uranium. However, as trade tensions have risen, Canada has begun to explore alternative markets for these valuable resources, particularly in Asia and Europe. By diversifying its energy exports, Canada is reducing its reliance on the U.S., further complicating the trade relationship. The U.S. has long been the dominant force in global energy markets, but as Canada diversifies its exports, the U.S. finds itself increasingly at risk of losing access to critical energy supplies. For instance, Canada's uranium exports, vital to the U.S. nuclear power industry, are now being directed toward Europe, where demand for clean, carbon-free energy is rising. This shift in energy trade is not just about diversification, it's a strategic maneuver that strengthens Canada's bargaining position and diminishes the leverage the U.S. once held over its northern neighbor. Canada's move towards energy diversification is part of a broader economic realignment. In July 2025, Canada made its first shipment of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to South Korea, signaling a clear departure from its historically U.S.-centric energy policy. As Canadian companies look to expand into new markets, the U.S. is left to grapple with the reality that its once secure energy supply chain is no longer guaranteed. In the wake of these developments, Trump's tariff strategy is increasingly being seen as a failure. While the administration originally pitched tariffs as a tool to revive American manufacturing, the reality is that these measures are doing more harm than good. The disruption to global supply chains, rising production costs, and the erosion of international trust are costing American businesses billions. The economic growth that Trump promised has not materialized, and the industrial revival he envisioned remains elusive. Moreover, as American businesses continue to suffer under the weight of these tariffs, the broader economic impact is becoming evident. Economists from the Congressional Budget Office have warned that the higher production costs in the auto industry, driven by steel and aluminum price hikes, could result in higher consumer prices. The impact of these price increases is expected to exacerbate inflation in the second half of 2025, further squeezing American households. This economic pressure is forcing many businesses to reconsider their long-term strategies, with some even pulling back on investments in the U.S. altogether. In addition to these economic strains, the geopolitical fallout from Trump's tariff policies is intensifying. Longtime U.S. allies are starting to question the reliability of the U.S. as a partner in trade and diplomacy. The European Union, for example, has voiced concerns about the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy, while countries like Japan and South Korea are exploring independent energy deals with Canada, bypassing Washington entirely. The erosion of trust in the U.S. has opened the door for new economic alliances, further isolating the country from the global stage. The unraveling of U.S. influence and Canada's strategic advantage. The growing backlash against President Trump's tariff policies reveals a deeper problem: the erosion of the United States' influence in the global marketplace and the gradual decline of its global leadership. One of the clearest examples of this shift is the growing influence of China, a country that has long been viewed as a rival to the U.S. on the global stage. As the world's largest producer of steel, aluminum, and electric vehicles, China has emerged as a key player in sectors that the U.S. once dominated. Trump's tariff policies have only accelerated this trend, pushing countries to seek more reliable and less contentious trading relationships. As Beijing continues to assert its influence, it has become evident that the U.S. is no longer the uncontested leader it once was. Meanwhile, Canada's role in this evolving global economy cannot be underestimated. While the U.S. has grappled with the consequences of its unpredictable trade policies, Canada has quietly repositioned itself as a key energy supplier and industrial hub. In addition to energy, Canada's abundance of key minerals, such as nickel, aluminum, and cobalt, has become increasingly vital in the global supply chain, especially in industries like electric vehicles, defense systems, and artificial intelligence. Ontario's vast reserves of high-grade nickel, which are crucial for the production of electric vehicle batteries and AI data servers, have made Canada a critical partner in the green energy revolution. As the U.S. faces challenges in sourcing these critical materials, Canada's wealth of resources is giving it an edge in negotiations, as countries increasingly look to Canada as a reliable and stable supplier. In the context of the broader U.S.-Canada trade relationship, the future remains uncertain. The Trump administration continues to float fluctuating tariff rates, adding to the confusion and instability that has characterized U.S. trade policy. Yet, despite the ongoing pressure, Canada remains resolute in its stance. No deal is better than a bad deal. With this unified position, Canadian provinces are standing firm in their commitment to protect the country's economic interests and ensure that no agreement locks them into detrimental trade terms with the U.S. As the U.S. faces mounting economic challenges and geopolitical isolation, it is clear that its relationship with Canada is at a crossroads. The once strong and predictable trade ties between the two countries are now being tested by unpredictable tariffs and shifting global alliances. But as Canada continues to strengthen its own economic and geopolitical position, the U.S. is being forced to confront the reality that its power is no longer as absolute as it once was. In the end, the question is not whether Canada can endure these tariffs, but whether the U.S. can afford to lose its most important trading partner in this new era of global competition. In a world where alliances are becoming more fluid and economic power is shifting, Trump's tariff strategy is beginning to look less like a strength and more like an Achilles heel. With Canada carving out its own path and the global order evolving without U.S. leadership, the future of U.S.-Canada relations will be defined by a delicate balance of economic and geopolitical forces. One thing is certain, the U.S. will no longer dictate the terms of the trade game, and Canada, for the first time in decades, is playing by its own rules.